Mr. Martinez.
Okay, well, welcome to this second day of the conference of this fourth Congress of the World Association of Dual Disorders. I'm José Martinez-Raga. I'm a psychiatrist in Valencia, Spain. I'm vice president of the Spanish Society of Dual Disorders. And I'm honored to be chairing, together with my friend and colleague from India, Jatanpal Singh Balhara, this session, which has great and fantastic speakers from different spots. Some of them are actually all friends, and the content is actually very exciting and very interesting. We're covering all different aspects from dual disorders and also aspects related to the nowadays of the COVID situation, but also providing advances, providing new insights into the management of these difficult patients with dual disorders. As I said, today is the second day. We had yesterday a very productive session with the speakers, and I'm really sure we're going to have another very exciting, very productive session today. I don't want to take much longer. I think the role is on the speakers, and I think that's what we want to hear. And therefore, please, Yatan, do you want to introduce this first talk of the session?
Thank you, Dr. Martinez, for the introductory comments. We begin with the first presentation, and this is going to be a joint presentation by ISAM and World Association on Dual Disorders. So we are having a total of 4 speakers for this presentation. I'll first invite Professor Maremmani and Professor Nestor Szerman to please begin with their presentation.
Yes, sorry, just one last thing, please. I would be very grateful if we can stick to the timings, because we have a very packed agenda. So it's very important to stick to the 20 minutes. We'll have time at the end for discussion and for questions that we'll be accepting through the different forums. So thank you. And
can I request Professor Maremanni and Professor Nestor Szerman?
I am ready. Can I have the slides?
Yeah, Mr. Benyamina, please, the slides for Mr. Maremmani. Mr. Benyamina. Yeah, I think that they're trying to put the slides.
Yes, we are working on it. So sorry for this disrupt. It's gonna be happening in just a few seconds.
Yeah.
It's for you, Mr. Remenier. Go ahead.
Hello. I have been involved in ISAM activities since its foundation, and I received its fellowship in 2016. Many years ago, as a president, I affiliated the EuroPAD, the European Opiate Addiction Treatment Association, to ISAM. I was a founding member of WADD, past treasurer, and now secretary. Last year, in New Delhi, I signed a collaboration agreement between ISAM and WADD with Nestor. You can well understand my satisfaction being at the first event organized together. And I hope that many others will follow. The answer to the question, do they have ISAM and WADD concurring synergistic interest, or are two companies mutually exclusive, is really pleonastic. Next slide, please. Dependence is not addiction. Dependence is a physiological reaction to the continued use of substances. Addiction is a behavior characterized by a craving for substance and relapsing behavior. But is this a single behavior, or is it better to speak of a dual disorder in the neuroscience context? According to Nora Volkov's thinking, addiction is not a disorder defined principally by a single behavior. Addiction involves a set of interconnected processes that can be targeted strategically. So, we need a personalization also in the treatment of a substance use disorder. But now, let us, Nestor, get on with this discussion. Next slide.
Next.
Microphone. Now? Now? Are you hearing me? Yes? Okay. I was telling that thank you, Ikro, for introducing the topic, and thank you to our colleagues from ISAM, Alex and Riaz, for sharing in this interesting conversation. Thank you. I was saying thank you to the chair of this session, Dr. Martinez-Raga and Dr. Balhara, for sharing the all-together session. To begin, I would like to explain the importance, the reason of the WDD in the field of psychiatry and addictive disorders. The WDD was created 5 years ago in order to highlight new findings from clinical neuroscience in the field of dual disorders. These findings identify some essential facts. First, addiction is a mental disorder. Therefore, according to from the new insights from the clinical neuroscience, is a brain disorder, according to NIDA. Second, current diagnostic categories or criteria do not allow for the inclusion of all complex syndromes of mental disorders, such as dual disorders. Third, WDD supports an alternative model of dual disorders from a transdiagnostic perspective, for example, RDoC project, based on clinical neuroscience and precision psychiatry. From this alternative model, compulsive drug use goes beyond simple reinforcement mechanism on the brain reward system. Research on dual disorder is going to identify distinctive endophenotypes in neurobehavioral mechanisms that predispose individuals to compulsive drug use or gambling. Next, please. No, the previous slide, please. I think the previous, I don't know. Okay, next, please. Okay, we know that substances with addictive potential have different and sometimes opposite effects on different groups of individuals. You can think, for example, in children who are receiving stimulants in order to improve the impulsivity, or there are another examples of different effects on different individuals. This kind of experience supports the so-called drug choice model. From this point of view, included into the precision psychiatry concept, we have proposed that we should treat the individual rather than the substance, as we have done so far. Next, please. Okay, another controversial point is the use of the different terms to define this topic. In this case, dual disorders or comorbidity. As is evident and clear, we have avoided using the term comorbidity. despite being aware of its wide use in the psychiatry literature. From an etymological perspective, Feinstein coined this term in the 70s for the coexistence of different and separate nosological entities. We emphasize that addiction are accompanied by other symptoms or other mental symptoms, mental disorder, or include specific personality traits that are closely related that can be simultaneous or sequential in the life cycle and that interact with each other. This controversial about the term is very old, and Professor Casas, that is present here in this in this moment, he coined the term in dual disorders a long time against the term dual diagnosis, because dual diagnosis means two different categorical diagnoses. Okay, I think it's a problem of term, but it's more deep than this controversial. The WDD and WPA section on dual disorder decided to use the broader term dual disorders instead of comorbidity, because it's linked to different, because this last term is comorbidity, is linked to categorical diagnosis. I think the next one is from ICRO. Next one, please. No, it's mine also. Therefore, the concept of dual disorders is based on clinical neuroscience. Clinical neuroscience is a strongly multidisciplinary field. It's the only guarantee, the dual disorder concept, that patients with addiction disorders, just like those with other mental disorders, will be treated with an integrated approach that combines both biological factors and psychological factors and social support, of course. Next one, I think, is from ICRO. Yes. ICRO is...
Thanks, Nestor. As already mentioned, with both WADD and ISAM sharing similar principles and values, we have signed a memorandum of understanding to maximize the potential of our mutual organization to share evidence and work together on specific work streams around education and research. It is good to remember the development of joint projects, such as a joint statement or a positional paper on dual disorder. This fact will bring the concept of dual disorder to a broader audience of doctors and researchers, improving acceptance and fighting the stigma that these patients often endure. Next, please. I would like to conclude this very short presentation with a sentence and two mottos. The sentence: we are so excited about working together. Two mottos: teamwork makes the dream work, and especially together we can make the difference. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professors Maremmani and Professor Nestor Szerman. I now invite Professor Riaz Khan and Professor Baldacchino to speak on behalf of ISAM.
it's Farouk.
Thank you. Good evening, colleagues. Thank you, I would say, the chair and the rest of the colleagues for inviting us also on this special occasion. First, I think, meeting between us. So I would like to briefly present the history of ISAM and then go on to our vision and the values that we have, and also fields of collaboration that we will be hoping to build together. So International Society of Addiction Medicine held its first meeting, the annual meeting, in the Betty Ford Center in Palm Springs in 1999. So we are at our 22nd annual conference this year. So we've come quite a bit. We're still young. We haven't reached maturity yet, but we're still young. And I think we've achieved a lot of things in this during this period. Especially the first meeting led to a desire to there was a need to create an international platform on which we could bring clinicians together, be it psychiatrists or general practitioners, to learn about addiction and to share knowledge, basically. So that was the principle based on it. And slowly we have built our team like this on it and collaboration on it. So the next slide, please. The vision, perhaps I won't read everything out, but just the vision, I think it's important. So our vision is a strong and forward-looking society in addiction medicine that supports its members and affiliate organizations to deliver high-quality patient-centered care all over the world. So I think it's important that we're not only just being responsible for the clinicians alone, but we're also working with affiliate societies who have these clinicians affiliated to. So it's an important aspect that we're trying to build. We have different committees for affiliate society. There are board members who are taking charge of different portfolios, I would say, in the association, in ISAM. So our core values remain innovation, excellence, learning, respect, collaboration, and diversity. I think that these are the values which define us. And our president-elect, or the future president, in a few weeks' time, Professor Alexander Baldacchino, will be taking over as the new president of ISAM for the next 3 years. So perhaps we can go on to the products, or the next slide, because this slide has been read. Yes. So now the mission as it is, I won't go through it in detail, but I think it's important that we are trying to create an awareness at the general physician level, but also the psychiatrist level, that they have to look after addiction because it's a behavioral disorder. We need psychiatrists to be involved in it. In Switzerland, where I was working for almost 32 years, I can assure you that not many psychiatrists are looking after addiction problems. It's been basically the general practitioner who's been looking after it. So I think ISAM's mission is really much more broader, and we're involving psychiatrists in it as well to take part in this venture. Now, the products that ISAM has created has been a textbook, which is at its 2nd edition. Professor Nadi Al-Gabali is the founding member of ISAM, and he has been mainly involved with this textbook with other colleagues as well. The certification exam is another product that we have created, and it's been working quite well. As you can see, there are 275 people who have set the exam for 22 different countries. So I can say we're truly getting to an international audience for this. And the ISAM Fundamental Workshop has been a recent addition to our products, basically. When I say products, I mean, I'm trying to say that we're creating for the needs of our members, basically. We're not just creating products so that people can purchase. We're creating products to the needs of our customers, basically. So, which are physicians, societies, and whatsoever. So basically, these fundamental workshops have been created on leadership training. I think it's an important aspect because traditional medical education or training does not provide you with any leadership training. You have to go through parallel tracks. So we are trying to create that, and also training of the trainers. Basically, how do you increase capacity building in certain countries? We don't have that. So we're trying to also think of these countries where capacity building is very important. And there is that famous annual meeting that we have. Unfortunately, this is the first time it will be a virtual meeting like this joint meeting we're having. So it was initially was planned to be in New Zealand, but for certain reason it couldn't go through. So now it is our support, or I would say from Canadian Association of Addiction Medicine, Society of Addiction Medicine rather, and ISAM Canada has taken over the mental, so they'll be hosting it. And we have some few conferences later on. So we're booked until, I would say, 2024, basically. So it's a 5-year planning almost. So we're booked for that. Next slide, please. So there are some of the board directors which I mentioned there. And I myself am the treasurer and chair of the finance committee of the board, and we have all the other colleagues in it. I organized the first Swiss conference for ISAM in 2012 in Geneva, and we had a participation of around 442 people from the French-speaking countries and also some English-speaking countries. And there have been a new addition since the last, I would say, a year and a half, 2 years, basically, interest groups which have been added to create more dynamic activities also. Neuroscience group, for example, the spirituality interest group, behavioral addiction group, I believe is managed by Mark Potenza. And policy practice interest group is also something that we're interested in. And finally, perhaps the next slide. No, that's it before Alex, but we have had some position papers also. This is something that we are dearly looking into on regular basis. So the neurosciences have come up with a position paper, if I'm not mistaken. Alex will correct me if I am. And we're working on other policy and practice interest group papers as well. Thank you very much for your attention, and perhaps we can have questions afterwards for the debate.
Thank you, Professor Khan, Riaz. My name is Alex Baldacchino, and I think it's important to describe that we all come from the same professional family. Riaz and myself are psychiatrists in training. And thank you very much. And actually, my academic department at St. Andrews University is based around precision addiction medicine. And I'm also a clinical director for a service run by National Health Service Scotland. And I have around 2,000 active patients, attending, treatment seeking, and being treated for their substance misuse related problems. So we're no different from when we talk about being members of ISAM, we're no different from being, having the same credentials or the same professional journeys, accreditation as people who are members of WADD. I thought, in answering to the title of this presentation, which is co-occurring synergistic interest or dually mutually exclusive, I prepared these two slides. It's really more food for thought here. I think, addiction, substance misuse, addiction medicine is well known for polarizing views, either because of the way the funding sources, the way politics tends to work, or the way people tend to really want to try to understand addiction. And so they package it in something that makes sense for certain members of the population. But I put here, some of the conversations that we've been having for years and years, and not just polarization. Sometimes you get, I call them different religions, because there's no way, and we all know there's no way of convincing anyone who feels that they are members of one religion to another. So, issues around harm reduction and abstinence, comorbidity. You mentioned dual disorders. What about multiple morbidities? Pharmacological, non-pharmacological addictions, legal drugs versus illicit drugs. Can neuroscience work with spirituality and human sciences? Medical against, non-medical clinicians, prescribers, non-prescribers, and psychiatrists and other medics. And the reason why I put this slide is because the ethos of ISAM is that really, it doesn't really matter. We are not in the business of forming some sort of church here. These are all important. And as we know, in our research or clinical environments, there's always a gray area in between. And there's always, when we think around having a patient-centric view of life, you realize that different individuals will have and will need different interventions at different moments of their life journey. Next slide, please. And so, for me, the answering the question, are we different? Is WADD different? What's different than ISAM? I do not think of differences. I think of the organization itself. I think of an organization or organizations, in this case, WADD as ISAM, that if they are supportive to their members, who are also, providing a service to their patients. If the organizations are forward-looking, if organizations believe in the power of collaborations, as I said, are patient staff-centric, not just patient-centric. If organizations are ecologically valid and they are not there because 20 years ago we were set up and there was a need, and so we still need to exist because we believe that need is still there. So we need to be very much reflective and self-critical around the validity of those organizations existing. Most important, if these organizations add value, and equally, I believe very strongly that organizations needs to be diverse. It's not, as I did say before we signed the memorandum of understanding in New Delhi last year. We get so much distracted by the polarizing views, and if WADD, is and should be different, exclusive from ISAM. I think if we use all these values that I've put in this slide, I think there's a great future, which at the end of the day is going to make a big difference to the way we deliver our services to the patients. Last but not least, but I think this reflects very much, next slide, reflects very much what Ikro said. I thought I'll put this, but it's very much what Ikro has put in his last slide. Good people make great organizations. And I believe very much that, members from WADD board and the colleagues, new and old friends that we have made in the last 2-3 years, when we're talking about the memorandum of understanding, but also realizing that, there's this synergy, that the potential of synergy together is possible because at the end of the day, we mean well and we want to make a difference. Next slide. Thank you very much. This is, by the way, where I live. I do not live in big cities, but I live in a very small village in Scotland. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. I thank all the 4 presenters from this session for sharing the principles, the vision, and the values of these 2 leading international associations. It's really encouraging to see the collaboration taking place, and I hope that a lot of good is going to come out of this collaboration for the field of addiction psychiatry and addiction medicine. So thank you all the 4 presenters for this particular presentation. We now move on to the next presentation. I'll again invite Professor Baldacchino once again. He'll be speaking on the topic Drug and Psychosis Project. Professor Baldacchino, please.
Thank you. Okay, again, thank you very much for WADD to invite us and invite me to be part of this great conference. Unfortunately, we cannot see the color of each other's eyes, but we are together in spirit. So I was asked to talk around this project, Drugs and Psychosis Project. And interesting title that I was asked to think about. I was talking about dual diagnosis. Actually, in all honesty, I think I will save you the concentration is, you know, I tend to use comorbid dual disorders under the same heading. And apologies, you know, after listening to Nestor about, you know, the precision medicine perspective of this. So in a way, I do not think that they are different. It's the semantics around it. So my approach to this presentation is around my experience, my research experience, which is founded within the clinical environment of trying to understand better dual disorders and or dual diagnosis or comorbidity in the last 15, 20 years. And what I'm always surprised is that some language, some narratives haven't changed much. So next slide, please. So I think, you know, in a way, sort of, you know, I'm using the word comorbidity here again, so apologies about that. But we're talking here of the year 2004, 5. You know, since then things have moved on. What the journey that started, you know, me looking at from a research perspective, either from a Scottish perspective or a European perspective, was around the fact that increasingly in one's patient population, you tend to see a lot of mental health related problems. And as a trained psychiatrist, and in the UK, as you very well know, you know, to become an addiction specialist, you need to train as a general psychiatrist first and then specialized in addiction. So as a trained addiction psychiatrist, I was acutely aware when I was setting up the services that I mentioned earlier on, that there needs to be a very clear skill mix, especially around supporting individuals who present with psychiatric illness or psychiatric disorders. So these were the initial papers and studies that I've done. I'm very proud of the fact that, you know, I was involved in a research environment, in a clinical political environment in Scotland in 2003, where it was very much encouraged to think beyond the box and to understand better. So better, you know, these issues in order to improve services. So the one on the right-hand side, the Scottish Executive Substance Use Research Programme, I think is something that I'll mention later on, but it is important. It was important at the time because it set the scene, especially for Scotland, but also within the European landscape, because we were recognizing that there were 3 major players in the field that would ultimately help change policy and practice. And that includes the service providers, the commissioners, and the service users. And using triangulation techniques, I'll later on explain some of the findings of that. Next slide. So the other thing that is important to perhaps appreciate, you know, in the beginning of this presentation, is that actually, you know, we use terms like comorbidity, we use terms like dual diagnosis at the early stage, now dual disorders, and I think we're talking of quite a heterogeneous population, and I agree completely. I think precision addiction medicine is one of those line of inquiry which might help us. But of course, you need to have the technology and the know-how to link different types of data sets, be it based around neuroscience and or big data, metadata, clinical outcomes, genotypes, etc. But these are two examples where you realize that the reality of the field, the way we tend to count patients, prevalence, incidence, epidemiology tend to be very skewed and very narrow-minded. And the first one was a study around, I wanted to sort of look around, people who die of intentional overdose, people who die of unintentional overdose. So intentional overdose, stroke, suicides, and unintentional ones are the people that we're most familiar with at that time in the field of substance misuse. And you find that there is so much commonalities behind these two populations. So sometimes it makes me think, perhaps we're using semantics here to differentiate something that does not really exist. What's also important, from an epidemiological point of view, 1/3 of the people who were considered as registered, who died as a result of suicide, were actually also registered in another database, separate database that did not link itself with the suicide database as people who died of unintentional overdose. The other perspective is, of course, we talk around, different types of disorders, and I agree completely that, it is important not to be caught by categorization and to try and understand better what's the level of risk. And hopefully with precision medicine, this was an attempt in 2014 to quantify that type of risk. Next slide. So going back to the Drugs and Psychosis Project. So actually in 2005 to 2010, I was involved in two different types of EU-funded projects. One was called the Drugs and Psychosis Project, where 4 European countries were involved. And the other one on the right-hand side is called the ISAM project, where 7 European countries were involved. They were both focused around people who were admitted into an acute psychiatric ward. The first one was very much as what you would expect as a study in order to understand what the pathology and the outcomes would be. The second one was more adventurous, and I think at that time very innovative, because it not only looked at the comorbidity patterns and dual diagnosis across the European sites. Next slide. But it also looked at the pathways through care for individuals with dual diagnosis, looking at nature, level, and type of networking. And in this case, really looking at the nitty-gritty of what do we mean when we talk about integration, when we talk about networking, working together. And last but not least, trying to predict and identify what are the variables that actually makes individuals who at that particular moment in time in their lives were admitted in an acute psychiatric ward as a result of a diagnosis called drug-induced psychosis. So next slide. And this summarizes the two projects. So the setting, as I said, was acute psychiatric wards, and the numbers, as you can imagine, people who've been involved in these type of studies, it's not easy to recruit 196 or even more, up to 152 individuals in different countries using the same standardized protocol, especially in an environment where things can be very unstable very quickly. The design was both designs of the two studies were opportunistic, descriptive field studies with repeated measures. Inclusion criteria, as you can understand and appreciate at the time, psychotic symptoms according to ICD-10. It's quite interesting is, thinking about what Nestor had said, is that actually if you do not in your proposal put, the fact that you are going to recruit individuals according to the ICD-10, you would not get funding at that time, especially within the European Union. Exclusion criteria: alcohol dependent, epilepsy, and others, but also people who were admitted and discharged within a 4-hour period. The groups were different, were categorized in different ways. The first one is because we wanted to know what the psychopathology looked like. We categorized them in groups with no illicit use, another with cannabis use, another one illicit but no cannabis use, and another one with all of the above. But the second study was grouped according to site and substance use because the focus was different. The follow-up period, 1 to 6 months, 9 months. Next slide. Objective tests were drug urine analysis. We used diagnostic tests, well-known diagnostic instruments, and also well-known instruments to look at the psychopathology. The results, I think this is important really. If people are interested, I'm more than happy to share the papers that have been being published for the 2 studies. But the results for the Drug and Psychosis EU project: positive symptoms within 6 months, all the groupings except, of course, the no illicit grouping was the control group, but the cohorts within the groupings where had illicit drugs but no cannabis has significantly been reduced, but not the group which the cohort which were selected as a result of cannabis. So basically within 6 months, the cannabis group were still presenting with positive symptoms of psychosis. For the other study, which I think is more important, is that prediction of service use and compliance adherence to treatment was not related to psychopathology at all, but was related to how integrated the service were or not. Of course, limitations, low number, selection, interview bias. You can imagine the heterogeneity related to systemic cultural differences and others. Next slide, please. Okay, and in a way, sort of, I'm now moving from sort of clinical research into policy issues here. And I think it's important really to recognize, and this is a photo really of a document that was published in a reputable journal, I think about a month ago. And we have Marta there as one of the co-authors. And the instructions there are no different than the instructions that I proposed when we did the Scottish executive studies. And if we go to the next slide, on the left-hand side here, you look at the issues that was quite interesting is that the issues identified in this population were common to service users, commissioners, and providers alike. But again, you find that these issues are still prevalent and pervasive within the systems that we work in, and some of them are not necessarily just issues based around the population of dual diagnosis. I think this is beyond that. It's more systemic, and these are including providing easy access to services and getting timely appropriate help, ability to provide a comprehensive service that can support individuals at different moments in time, over reliance on the use of medication, lack of service user involvement in the care planning, and lack of holistic focus in services, amongst many others. The impact of double stigma is pertinent, and I've put in this slide here from India, knowing that one of our co-chairs from India is interesting in this day and age. COVID has enhanced perhaps this notion of stigma, has as much as it highlighted the inequalities, but it also provided the opportunity to start talking and planning ways of, how is the new normal going to look like, but also recognizing that some individuals are more vulnerable than others. And people with dual disorders are top on the list for that. I've put in here the reorganizing of substances. This is one of our ISAM survey.
Sorry for the interruption.
I'm finishing. I'm finishing. So, and that looked at, what happened during COVID-19 and the provision of services for mental health and substance misuse related problems. Next slide. So I think, in a way, I think it's important as well to highlight the fact that for future psychiatrists, we need to teach people not only in the business of dual disorders, but in the business of managing complexity. And also for commissioners to realize that when resources are not there, that tends to result itself in increased morbidity and mortality. And these are two papers that highlight that. I think the next slide, I think is the last one. Take home messages are, for me too, is one, if we train and manage individuals, clinicians, in appreciating the evidence around dual disorders, but also supporting the notion that systems are there in order to help patients, not to discriminate patients. And the second one is, this is a paper looking at the psychopathology itself, where when you see a patient in casualty or in other acute services, the important thing is not how many drugs individuals have taken, but also, when you look at the pathology, it's no different from other type of psychotic disorders, and hence, you need to be very clear around what your care pathway looks like. So my last slide. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Baldacchino, for sharing the findings from your work as well as your insights. It's a known fact that when we talk about populations with drug use disorder and psychotic disorders, they don't only differ in terms of the presentation, but also the help-seeking behavior that they have. So it's an important area to invest in, and probably we need to have more cross-national studies with similar methodology that can give us more deeper insights into this issue.
Yes.
With that, we move on to the next presentation, and the next one is on a very interesting hypothesis that has been with us for a very long time, the self-medication hypothesis. This has been proposed to explain why dual disorders exist in certain individuals. It has been debated, it has been discussed a lot in the past few decades. I'll be inviting Professor Miguel Casas to share his thoughts on this topic. Professor Casas, please.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for inviting me to this second webinar of the WADD Congress. Well, I will try to explain in easy words what is the self-medication hypothesis and the relationship with dual disorders. The relationship between classical disorders, psychiatric disorders and addictions, it's quite still now quite a very difficult, understandable process. The interaction between, we must say the synergistic interaction between classical psychiatry disorders and addiction can be explained in this grid that we must accept that we don't know very few on this kind of interactions, which is the relationship between psychosis and cocaine, or opiates, or amphetamines, or hallucinogens. We use normally a way to explain this synergia, telling that the symptomatology of psychosis, of the classical psychiatric syndromes, has drug addiction
as an addiction of the main symptomatology. But it's not really like this. We must consider it's not a simple addiction, but it's a synergia. Well, we will try to explain, we will try to explain the self-medication hypothesis, first showing some basic questions that arise by professional drug users, families, and patients related to the dual disorders. Why do addictions happen? Why do addictions persist? Why do patients relapse? And why so much drug comorbidity? Which is strange. Family says, well, we have a real problem at home. We have a family with schizophrenia, but at the same time, now we have schizophrenia plus addictions. What happens really? Because our child is not so bad. It's not a vicious man. What really happens? When we will try to explain this dual disorder relationship with classical psychiatry by the self-medication hypothesis, which are the etiopathogenesis of dual disorders. It can be disorders independent. Classical psychiatry disorders and drug addiction can be independent, can be iatrogenic, can be psychotoxic. Drugs can induce psychotoxic experiences to patients taking drugs, can be a vulnerability, shared vulnerability, or can be self-medication. Well, we will only talk in this short talk on the self-medication hypothesis in dual disorders that can help to answer the high prevalence of drug comorbidity in our patients. Well, the self-medication hypothesis has a very easy definition. Many individuals use drugs as an attempt to self-medicate for a many range of psychiatric disorders or emotional states. This means that they use drugs as a treatment. When we, psychologists or psychiatrists, we fail to provide them cure or to enough improvement, then they normally in a period now at present that drugs are so widespread for in all kinds of countries or psychiatrists, then we must consider that almost all psychiatric patients they will try at least sometimes during their life drugs, what we tell drugs, and many times these drugs improve the symptomatology. Of course, they will after this maybe become the disaster of addiction and all kind of problems related with addiction, but we must accept that some of these drugs improve the symptomatology of these patients. Well, then we must accept that psychosis can induce the consumption of opiates. In fact, for many centuries, opiates has been used in psychiatry in order to improve psychotic symptoms, depressive symptoms, or anxiety. Laudanum, opium, has been very well introduced far from the Egyptians. Or also we can accept that depression, resistant depression, can induce the consumption, the use of cocaine. If a depressive patient that is relapsing and that they really feel bad, if he use once cocaine, they can improve really the symptomatology, and later on it is not acceptable for him to that doctors will say then, well, you will destroy your life. His life is already destroyed by the depression, and if they can improve, well, for many only some minutes or maybe half an hour, 1 hour, this disaster experience of the depression, they will try to use as many times as possible cocaine. Or ADHD, we can accept that cannabis improves symptomatology in ADHD, and also cocaine, etc., etc., etc. Then the self-medication hypothesis, it's a formulation in order to explain dual disorders, but we must accept, we must recognize that it's very controversial, because many professionals accept the self-medication hypothesis in order to explain this high comorbidity. But surprisingly enough, there's very few policymakers that accept them, and also very few editors of journals accept them. And why? Well, first, because we have not really good studies. We will see later that we have not good studies, good clinical trials in order to be sure that this hypothesis is correct. But mainly because policymakers, editors of the journals, they are afraid that being accused of promote legalization or liberalization of drug use if they accept the self-medication hypothesis. Because if you accept the self-medication hypothesis, and psychiatry and psychology, we accept also that they cannot solve the illness of such patients. Maybe finally we must accept that if opiates or psychostimulants can improve this symptomatology, maybe patients have the right to take drugs in order to improve the illness. People that we like self-medication hypothesis, we like to remember that maybe the first who talk in a strange way, of course, of self-medication, not really self-medication, he didn't use drugs, but says that the strange behavior could improve by some, not really drugs, but substances, can be Honoré de Balzac, a French writer, that he says that he was a stud man who had an incredible passion for oysters. This was a wise and a moral man that took 100 to 200 oysters, but he said finally he ate oysters not because gluttony, but because he needed oysters. At present, we cannot run a clinical trial in bipolar disorders in lithium against oysters, but we must remember that oysters, they are an animal that has a lot of oleoelements in the parenchyma. Then maybe it could be that Honoré de Balzac, that he was a writer that describes like a photograph the French society, has seen people eating a lot of oysters, dozens, hundreds of oysters, and they has a better character after, or they were much more friendly with people. We don't know this, but it's interesting to know that the observation of some strange behaviors can help us to understand which is the self-medication hypothesis. For example, we have new examples, classical medical references, adolescent girls that licked white walls because they lack calcium. This has been many described in Andalusia in Spain, that we know that the houses are painted in white, and this white is made with calcium. Or adolescent girls who like rusty parts because they like iron. This has been also described in the literature of the 19th century. Or food craving during pregnancy, where girls don't ask for fruits or ask for kind of food that they are not available at this period of the year. Now it is they have disappeared because we have, with the planes and the possibility to translate all kind of foods from every everywhere in the world this has disappeared. But when it has been described, food craving during pregnancy means that people these girls, pregnant girls, ask for strawberries when there was not time of strawberries, or like for any kind of food when there was impossible to have these foods this period of the year. Well, now we consider that these ask of these funny behaviors, because they knew very well that it was impossible to have strawberries at this period of the year, was really the lack of many oligoelemental vitamins during the pregnancy. Nevertheless, in the more scientific way, has been Sandoz Rado, an Hungarian psychoanalyst, that he has not really formulated the self-medication hypothesis like we understand now, but he has been the precursor of how psychoanalysis accept at present the self-medication hypothesis. Nevertheless, we must say that has been Vincent Dole and Martinez-Raga that the first formulate the self-medication hypothesis, because in 1964 they proposed that the heroin addiction was a metabolic illness, and that patients took heroin because they needed heroin, they needed it. We must remember that in 1964, science has not yet discovered the opiate system, and no one knows that there was opiate endorphins, opiate endogenous opiates. Then Vincent Dole and Martinez-Raga, really, I think that they would merit really the Nobel Prize, but never happens in drug addiction. This is very difficult. But Vincent Dole and Martinez-Raga saying that heroin patients need heroin, formulate the self-medication. Dr. Charles O'Brien, in an article in 1988, the self-medication hypothesis without saying really self-medication hypothesis. And finally has been Professor Edward Katchen in the Harvard Medical School that has formulated the self-medication hypothesis in the psychoanalytic way. It's very interesting to read how Professor Katchen argued the vulnerability of cells to explain why some patients, some consumers of drugs become addicted and others not. This has been very interesting. Fortunately, this hypothesis, psychoanalytic hypothesis, has been formulated by Edward Katchen, has been taken by people working in neurosciences, and at present, the self-medication hypothesis is a psychoanalytic hypothesis, basic psychoanalytic hypothesis, but also a hypothesis in the field of neuroscience. It's fun to say that reviewing the literature on the self-medication hypothesis, we cannot find an article testing the hypothesis really, but many articles, mainly in drug addiction, argue in favor or against the self-medication hypothesis. You can see this review that we have made until 2018. Now we are finishing another one. And you can see that in green, it's the people that likes the self-medication hypothesis, the articles that says that probably self-medication hypothesis exists, but it's not possible to be sure at present because there is not any real study that showing that it's truth. And there are many articles that they are very hesitant, and few people going against the self-medication in articles published in the literature, scientific literature. Then I will finish saying that the self-medication hypothesis offers a valid explanation for the high prevalence of drug use in psychiatric disorders, the mental disorders. Sorry, something happens. Many articles in addictions and general psychiatry refers to self-medication hypothesis, although no specific research is at present available. Clinicians mostly accept the self-medication hypothesis. At present, there are no systematic review research on self-medication hypothesis, and that I think it's time now to try to have the clinical research, a clinical trial, trying to demonstrate that self-medication hypothesis is a good way, a good response in order to explain why dual disorders exist. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Miguel. It's really enjoyable to listen to you as always. I really thank you for your time and your participation. Well, our next speaker is Riaz Khan, that we heard before in the introduction from about ISAM. He's a psychiatrist and psychotherapist in Geneva, as well as professor of psychiatry in Balhara University in Pakistan, where he's originally from. Please, Professor Khan.
Thank you. So perhaps we can go on to the slide, please. Yes, thank you. So this is from my experience when I was head of the emergency psychiatry in the University Hospital of Geneva. Having worked in addiction before, so I was confronted with this issue of alcohol use disorders, and the staff of the ER had, or the casualty had, is being in the acute care. So these patients were stigmatized and were not really taken care of. So there was an observation that was there. Next slide, please. Out of 773 patients seen at triage for alcohol abuse and intoxication, 49% of them went without being even seen by a physician. So they were literally asked to leave the emergencies. Now, the emergencies represent what is happening in the society. In any ER center or any ER, I would say, services, this is what is happening in the community. So if we are pushing back these patients who are having these disorders, that means they're already been stigmatized and not given access to treatment. So I was curious about this. And secondly, the medical director of the university hospital had asked me specifically to understand this issue. How can we establish a procedure so that none of these patients go without having had a medical file, basically? So next slide, please. Now, I could have created a procedure myself from top bottom, but I said it's not going to work. So I decided to create a working group in which we created a questionnaire, and this questionnaire was given on SurveyMonkey, basically. So it didn't cost us anything except for having I would say a subscription to that, which I already had. So I used that subscription to send it to the staff by email over a period of 3 months, and then following it up, obviously, before closing the observational study. Can we go on to the results of the next slide, please? So there is a team of 99 ER collaborators, or somatic team, as I call them, and 15 psychiatric collaborators in them, basically. So the unit of emergency psychiatry is situated within the ER itself. We're in a corner, I would say already stigmatized that this is the corner for the psychiatry, but we do see around 7,000 patients a year. and 24/7 we respond to them. And I can tell you one thing, that 80% of the patients that I've evaluated during the past 3 years when I was in charge of the addiction unit, 80% of them went back to the community. So they were not necessarily hospitalized. But as we know that patients do present themselves to healthcare units with a crisis manifestation. So however, these are the profile of these participants in there. We just had a slight majority, I would say 51.3% of all the staff that participated. So I could say the results are valid because more than 50% participated in the survey. So we were able to go forward and establish what were the needs of these staff. Could we move forward, please, for the next slide? Yes, so we had stratification of the gender, so 68% being female in the ER. A lot of female psychiatrists, a lot of female physicians and nurses, obviously. So the age group was also stratified. As we can see, people more than 55 years, there were very little. But however, the majority remained between 25 and 45. Years of experience also was greater than 10 years. I think we had about 15, 20 years. I can't see that slide properly, but anyway, it should be that. The next slide, please. And so the questions which were asked were very simple. Do you feel comfortable with alcohol use disorder patients? 46% said no, but 54% said yes, they were comfortable with it. Now, this is the whole ER team that is speaking. So ER is the best place for AUD patients to be seen. 64% said yes, and 36% said no. Now, alcohol use disorder management, is it adequate in the ER? 40% said no, and 60% were approving that it was adequate. So there were different perceptions we can have over here. Next slide, please. So the other question was, is ideal clinical pathways for AUD patients, is it somatic, psychiatric, or mixed, both of them together? So 75%, an overwhelming majority, said it should be a mixed approach to this disorder. So we can start speaking about dual disorder perhaps here. Now, there is ideal management place for AUD in which part of the emergencies would it be? So they still said it should be in care room, 66%. They shouldn't be left out onto the waiting room or in only in the psychiatric or observation areas, but they should be in a care room, basically in the ER. So could we move to the next slide, please? Now, what was discussed was that we needed to document and secure the triage at this level. So the message was that any patient who comes for an alcohol use disorder must have a systematic documentation. We need a clinical observation if there is any trauma, absence of suicidal ideation, and systematic actions being taken as parameters for the Glasgow Coma Scale, pupils, and so forth. And if there was a suspicion of acute alcohol intoxication at triage, we should measure the breath alcohol level. And if that's not possible, we should have a blood alcohol level, and the patient should be installed in a care room. Next slide, please. So every patient must be cared for. No patient leaves without the consultation. And if immediate care was not possible, we needed to secure the triage and write down the triage of somatic and psychiatric and write it down in this part of the medical informatic file of the patient, basically. So every patient needed to be evaluated by an ER physician with a file plus the psychiatric team. So I think this was a big achievement, that to have a consensus on how to manage this acute alcohol intoxication. Next slide, please. Now, the discharge conditions for alcohol intoxications were that obviously physical examination had to be performed, and the person should be fully independent and in a secure manner be able to move around. And from a psychiatric point of view, we needed to do a screening with the ASSIST, that's alcohol, substance, smoking involvement screening test, which, by the way, the French version was translated by my team, myself, and with the WHO. And then the brief intervention was provided and patient was oriented towards outpatient care. The next slide, please. Now, a patient, in a scenario when you have a patient with an alcohol withdrawal, which is in progress, how were we supposed to manage that? Could we go to the next slide, please? So the same questions were asked there, and 75% of them felt comfortable with the management, and they figured that 58% that ER was the best place for management. And so that means acute care was provided, and ER management, was it adequate? And 83% of them said, yes, it was adequate for these patients. Can we move to the next slide, please? Ideal clinical pathway, they all said it was a mixed one. I think this is, again, an interesting change of perception, which wasn't there before by the team. So the two teams got closer and were working in synergy, basically. So the ideal management place, 83% of them said they should be in care rooms, basically, and not left out in the observation or waiting rooms. They have to be not assigned to a specific domain, but a care where synergistic care could be provided for these patients. And structured management, is it useful? They said yes, 86% of them agreed that a structured management would be useful for these situations. Next slide, please. So at triage, the respect of clinical SIVA monitoring was supposed to be done. The scale that allows us to manage and introduce any treatment if need be for the withdrawal. Blood sugar should be done. Patient has to be examined and oriented towards a care room, and continued evaluation monitoring was done. So this was for a situation where alcohol withdrawal was in progress. You cannot legally, and I would say morally and ethically, let a person walk out of an emergency or casualty department while he is in alcohol withdrawal. Next slide, please. So we established a treatment protocol already for these patients when the SIVA scores were not complicated. Patient could receive treatment orally, and I would say when they had observed, they had a SIVA score of less than 8 and 2 hours of observation, they could stay for another 4 hours in the ER and then have an ambulatory management and discharge from there, basically. So roughly speaking, a patient would, in this situation, uncomplicated situation, would stay in the ER between 4 to 6 hours, depending on the workload, basically, which is an interesting time frame. Could you go to the next slide, please? So this was for severe withdrawal. Obviously, it's a more complicated algorithm. But the idea was that if we are in front of a complicated withdrawal that is SIVA greater than 16 or equal to 16, we need to think of the possibility of eventually giving things in an injectable way, and maybe intubation of the patient may be required if the situation requires it. Otherwise, we have on the left of your screen, at least to my left, this will be the normal protocol of oral medication. By the way, in my 32 years of working in addiction, I would have to say that 90% of my alcohol withdrawal that I've done in my integrative center for addictions, basically, had been on outpatient basis. Patients were never hospitalized. So it goes to show that it is pretty safe to manage things in the outpatients. Could we go to the next slide, please? Now, discharge orientation from the ER was that the ambulatory transfer was envisaged if the follow-up was assured and organized by the ER psychiatric team. So we needed to do our job to liaise with our colleagues in the outpatient, specifically the psychiatric addiction department. And absence of clinical withdrawal signs were present, absence of acute psychiatric and somatic illnesses. And the patient score on SIVA was less than 8 after 4 hours. So if these conditions were not fulfilled, we had to envisage other situations that the patient may need temporary hospitalization in the main hospital in different departments. So this was also a big achievement because alcoholic patients are usually sent to Geneva to psychiatric hospitals. So this was another major achievement. Could we go to the next slide, please? So walk-in alcohol withdrawal request, how do we manage that? This was another case scenario we had to deal with. And could we go to the next slide, please? So the same questions were asked, and this time an overwhelming majority said no. They are not comfortable with managing walk-in demands for alcohol withdrawal. Is the ER the best place to respond to that? 82% said no. It can be understandable. The ER management, is it adequate of these patients? Well, 52% said no. So it's the same percentage which was saying that it was they were not comfortable, but they were not comfortable with the management as well. So could we go to the next slide, please? So the ideal clinical pathway was given this time to the psychiatric team, which I understand perfectly well, being a psychiatrist there. The ER colleagues had other things to do. So I think this is not a crisis management, but a request for information and orientation. So psychiatrists would be able to give a better feedback on that. So the ideal place for management would be the psychiatric unit, 73% said. And a structured procedure would be useful. Overwhelmingly, 94% agreed with this question. Could we go to the next slide, please? So I would say the withdrawal demand and reorientation to the outpatient by the psychiatric team was envisaged by 84% of the people. So we were working not against each other. I think we were delegating duties as a team, and the psychiatric team was very happy to handle this situation. Could we move to the next slide, please? So the walk-in patient seeking alcohol has to be clinically stable, no symptoms or signs of withdrawal. At triage, all the parameters are within norm and the SIVA is 0. So the orientation toward the psychiatric team was from the triage. And the idea was to evaluate the motivation stage of the individual and analyze his demand more to orientate him towards the outpatients and propose a planned, coordinated, I would say, move towards the outpatient. So I think what our main purpose there was to do a brief orientation and orientate the patient towards community healthcare, basically in the field of addictions, which is a separate unit or division in Switzerland, but managed by psychiatrists, obviously. Could we have the next slide, please? So I would say the take-home message from this would be that alcohol use disorder patients usually come to the ER in a personal crisis manifestation. I think this is very true for all addictive patients or patients suffering from addictions. They manifest to healthcare dispositives or centers in a crisis situation. So we need to be very attentive to that. This is our bread and butter. Even the psychiatric patient, they usually enter the healthcare center through a crisis manifestation most of the time, if they don't have sustained follow-up in the outpatient. So a systematic evaluation of AUD patients was achieved through a consensus-oriented change of perceptions of the ER staff through a participative approach in this survey. So it was an important milestone that for the first time, the two teams were not working antagonistically, but they were agreeing on things and were understanding the needs of each other and also the specificities of each other in this. So this approach or this survey led me to create a procedure which I believe is an important milestone, because there was no such procedure before in a university hospital of managing alcohol. And the idea was that it guaranteed quality of care, safety of the patients, and help combat the stigma of substance use patients arriving in the ER. I'd just like to give you some figures that we have 30,000 alcohol-dependent patients in Geneva, and about 20 to 25% of them manifest themselves in treatment centers. So there are hardly the majority of them don't go to treatment, basically. While as we look at the addictive heroin addict patients, we have in Geneva itself 3,000, and almost 75% of them are in treatment, some form of treatment, be it methadone, heroin, whatever. So the disparity is there. It's a public health problem, alcohol, but somehow it doesn't seem to get that attention which it needs to achieve. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Khan. It's been really very enlightening, and yes, and we're very pleased. I'm very happy for this presentation. Well, I'm very glad to present our next speaker. He's a good friend of mine, and an old friend from France, where he's a practicing psychiatrist and addictologist, and Professor Benyamina. He is large experience in addictions. He's organizing the next WADD meeting. So please welcome.
Thank you very much, Professor Martinez-Raga and all colleagues. You can pass my slideshow now. Okay. It's possible to pass my slideshow?
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Oh. With secretary.
It's okay.
Thank you. I don't see it.
Oui, Monsieur Benani, il faut activer la présentation, s'il vous plaît.
Epigenetics and their disorder, and I want to say thank you to Mehdi Paez for this topic. Next. Okay. My conflict interest. Next. Currently, there is an increasing demand for mental health care. Patients are beginning to understand that effective treatments exist and are more likely to seek medical management for their mental disorders. The current mental health care system is largely understaffed and under-budgeted, thus access to treatment is often delayed. The use of accurate biological markers could help to determine which patients are in need of treatment or could rapidly target appropriate medications to quickly improve their condition and get them back into society. Genetics and pharmacogenetics studies could pave the way to improve mental health care management. Next. Next. Currently, cannabis is the third most frequently used psychoactive substance on the planet, and after tobacco and alcohol. Okay, first, if you can count caffeine. There is an increasing demand for healthcare, and in many countries in the world, it is the main substance for which patients consult an addictions specialist. It is also a substance which is associated with an increased risk of psychosis. The question is, could epigenetics and genetics mechanism be implicated in this case, in these risks? Next. Changes in environmental exposure, such as changing cannabis composition, may have a major impact on the risk for psychosis associated with cannabis risk. Another question is, could these changes in composition and concentration have an epigenetics influence either in terms of psychosis, of cannabis use disorder, of both? Next. Genes in cannabis kinetics ACB1. Next. In this study, our story of cannabis kinetics and cannabis use disorders begins very quietly with a polymorphism that was supposedly silent. Then along came Kimchi Sarfati in 2007, who showed that even though certain polymorphisms then change the amino acid sequence of a protein, that doesn't mean the protein remains unchanged. ABC1 transcription rates can be changed, while the protein waits for its messenger RNA, that's changing protein folding as it is produced. This change in shape impacts the protein's kinetics, which is crucial, especially when that protein is a transporter protein such as ABCB1. We already have some agreements from animal studies that delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol was an ABCB1 substrate, so we decided to test the association with cannabis use disorder in a clinical population. Next. As you can see, the allele and genotype distribution for ARIS 1045-642 is very different between our patients and controls, with a significantly greater proportion of C alleles and CC genotypes among patients. Next. As you can see, this association holds for the C34-35 SNP after adjusting for other variables such as tobacco use disorder, addictive, psychiatric, and family history of mental disorders. What be surprised as what that CC allele is associated with highly active form of ABCB1. We believe that the more rapid THC elimination could be related to more frequent withdrawal and possibly increased symptoms, thus greater likelihood of cannabis use disorder. Next. In 2018, we published the pharmacokinetic study in relation to genotype in 39 of our patients. We did show that T allele carriers had significantly lower cannabinoid levels in the blood versus C carriers. Our hypothesis was that they may have been quicker blood clearance of cannabinoids and potentially greater cannabinoid stores within the brain and fatty tissues. Next. We hadn't imagined at that time that our research might be seated in relation with adult antisocial behavior. This is quite interesting since personality is quite related to substance use disorder. This sample, taken from a larger population with alcohol use disorder, was characterized for antisocial personality traits. In the sample, no single SNP achieved genome-wide significance. Although ABCB1 did achieve is in one sample. Unfortunately, this was not confirmed in a second sample. ABCB1 has also been associated with opioid addictions, as well as treatment outcomes for addictions and depression. Next. Now about cannabis receptor gene association. Moving on to another important gene candidate, the cannabinoid receptor 1 or CNR1 gene. Next. In another hypothesis driven search for gene markers, several studies have examined the eventual role of the endocannabinoid receptor gene 1 gene, or CNR1, in addictive disorder. In 2010, we examined the existing association studies of CNR1 with addictive disorder. At the time, very few well-characterized cannabis populations had been studied. These 4 studies included Caucasian populations with drug use disorder, DSM-4, drug dependence. There was a significant association between drug use disorder and greater than 16 CNR1 AAT repeats. This association was also found in a single African Caribbean population with cocaine dependence by Ballon and all in 2006. Next. As you can see, in populations of intravenous drug user, there is a significant amount of heterogeneity between association studies. There is no significant association between AAT repeats defined as greater than 14 repetitions and intravenous drug use. Next. Since 2011, there have been fewer hypothesis-driven genetic association studies published in the literature. Such an all performed an imaging study including 37 controls versus 94 heavy cannabis users defined as smoking cannabis more than 4 times per week over the past 6 months. The areas 23, 239 polymorphism was determined and compared to hippocampus volume. As you can see, G allele was predictive of a lower hippocampus volume in cannabis users. The association was not valid for amygdala volume. Another study by Hall and al. Showed an interaction between CNR1 polymorphism and cognitive deficits in schizophrenic subjects who use cannabis. Next. What about dopamine gene in CUD? You know, COMT, catechol methyltransferase, is a key player in dopamine regulation. Its role is to deactivate dopamine within the mesolimbic and prefrontal cortex. This structure also happens to play a major role in both addiction and psychosis. Both alleles are frequent in the general population with about 50-50 distribution for each. Next, in theory, yes, sorry, next. Okay. In theory, the MET allele is associated with the lesser COMT activity, and thus more dopamine remains in the system. Or, next, the VAL allele, on the other hand, is related to the stronger COMT or activity, thus the dopamine levels stay in check. According to the hypodopaminergic hypothesis, Val carriers would need stronger sensorial stimulation to feel adequate reward levels. That's the theory. What does the science tell us? Next, Roncero and all examined a small clinical population and found a correlation between COMT allele and the presence of cannabis dependence. The study does not state if they corrected for other confounding factors. In unpublished data from our group, we found no association between cannabis use and COMT polymorphism. Next. In this imaging study from 2013, Balhara and all showed that ventral caudate volume it seems to be influenced by the COMT allele. Controls who had more MET alleles had larger left ventral caudate volumes than Val carriers. Chronic cannabis user had the opposite tendency with much smaller left ventral caudate volume for MET carriers than Val carriers. Next. The opposite was shown in the amygdala with a much smaller left amygdala volume in controls with more MET alleles and a smaller volume in cannabis user with the MET alleles. This study that shows the genotype in addition to environmental factors such as cannabis exposures can have an influence on brain morphology, similarly to the previous shown study on CNR1 genotype. Next, of course, the question of causality remains entirely no resolved. Several studies have shown some associations between temperamental traits such as novelty seeking and COMT vals, as shown in infants in a study of Marquand and al. IRA and all have observed that Val carriers have poorer memory performance and attention than other genotypes, regardless of whether or not there was any associated psychosis. In all of these studies, the question remains entirely open as to the role of COMT in the evolution of cannabis use disorder. Would it play a role through a direct causal mechanism? This seems unlikely given our current observation. Another question: does it play an indirect role, and through which mechanism? Through corrective traits, cognitive modifications, vulnerability to neurotoxic mechanisms. Further research is necessary to elucidate this question. Next, what about clock gene and CUD? Next, anyone who has worked with addiction patients has often seen that they have difficulties sleeping or live with by night and sleep by day. Until now, there have been no studies significantly targeting clock gene in cannabis addiction. We used our cannabis population's genomes to type our clinically relevant clock polymorphism in association study. These data have been submitted for publication. Next, just a reminder, this is still the same population we saw earlier, which is characterized by greater addictive family and psychiatric history. Next, this is the list of our 20 clock gene. A total of 204 polymorphisms were tested for an association with cannabis use disorder. Next, our study showed a clear association between pair 1 HEAS7 and cannabis use disorder after adjusting for other cannabis. Next. Aries 144, 2,849 TT genotype was overrepresented in cannabis users with more severe clinical features such as personal psychiatric history, employment status, cannabis use under the age of 16, and weekly cannabis use that was greater than 13 grams per week. Okay. Next, epigenetic psychosis and cannabis use. So what have we learned about epigenetics and psychosis of cannabis use? Next, in terms of genetics in fetal, will develop within a certain environment. His mother's environment influences by substance use or not, maternal stress or calm, and external environment, harmonious or conflictual family environment, the environment in which the family lives, urban or rural, a whole host of influences to which that individual must adapt in order to thrive. The fetus will inherit a certain genome from his parents. This is only fundamental building block. Additional modifications enable the structure to be adapted and fine-tuned to its ever-changing environment. Cumulated adaptations can lead to an increased vulnerability and then a final conversion to psychosis. Next. As you can see, there are numerous additional means of preventing or facilitating gene transcription, trough, histone, and nucleosome modification, as well as methylation. These modifications ensure that genes are transcribed only as necessary in order to adapt to given environment. Next. In this original study, my colleague Usama Kibir and the team from Saint-Anne showed that there were genome-wide modification in methylation profiles in patients during conversion to psychosis. There were also some regional specific modifications that had taken place. The question then becomes called, could cannabis use also cause epigenetic modifications, and could there be some overlap between the two processes? Next. I cannot show you all of this unpublished data, but in a preliminary studies, but this same team of 78 cannabis users by phenotype, the user according to the quantity of cannabis use. They showed an association with the X and Y chromosomes. Also, there was no differences between the sex in terms of use. It also noteworthy that there were association with neuronal differentiation factors which could be related to changes in the brain, and as well as a vulnerability to psychosis. It is certainly a fascinating prospect, and I hope we'll be seeing some further data in the near future. Next.
Okay, I mean 2 minutes.
One. Just
okay,
one.
Great.
Okay, next. In closing, I would like to state that there are some very interesting prospects for the future in terms of genetics and epigenetics research. There is ongoing research into the genetic vulnerability to cannabis use disorder, as well as any associated gene for psychosis. Cannabis use may cause epigenetic modifications and be associated with increased psychosis risk. Improved understanding the pathophysiology of this modification could lead to discovery of genetic risk markers, as well as to potential therapeutics, perhaps even future epigenetic studies. Thank you very much. Next.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, it was fantastic talk, actually. And I really thank you for presenting this unpublished data, this very up-to-date data. Now our next speaker, and I'm really sorry, but we're running a bit behind schedule, is Dr. Carlos Roncero. Again, he's a very good friend, and he's Vice President of the Spanish Society of Dual Disorders, and he's professor at the University of Salamanca and head of psychiatry at the Salamanca Health Services. Please, Carlos, Dr. Roncero.
Good evening for everybody. I am trying to share my presentation. Okay. Can you see the presentation?
Yeah, Carlos, I think that the presentation is coming. Huh?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, okay, now. Well, it's not possible to share my presentation from my laptop, so please go on with the presentation that I sent you.
It's okay. Okay.
Carlos, yes. Can you put my presentation, please? Yes, perfect. Okay. Okay. So, the next slide. First of all, I would like to thank to the organizers of the Congress, especially Professor Mendy-Pais, for inviting me to this meeting. I would like to share our kind of pacing. Today, I am going to do this presentation that is a very clinical presentation on the homeless people and the relationship with the dual diagnosis in the COVID times. Next slide, please. Homeless people has been proposed or has been described as one of the groups most affected by the pandemic, because there are some, they are suffering some special situation, and because there are some previous experience with the SARS and influenza infection or pandemics. Next slide. Homeless. Next slide, please. Homeless people. Please, next. Okay. Come back to the number 5. Okay. Homelessness are related with a special situation as worse health conditions, lack of information of the pandemic due to that they have no access to the mass media or to some of the media that we use for connecting each other. As well, they are a population with a bad alimentation, with depression, they have lack of sleep because they are sleeping in the streets, and as well has been described that dual disorders and smoke is related with the lung disease. So, in theory, they are a more vulnerable population, even out of the COVID pandemic. Next slide. It is well known that homeless people have a high risk of mortality, bigger than the non-homeless population, as you can see, between 5 and 10 times higher than general populations. So the COVID pandemic has been proposed as a new factor associated with this high rates of mortality. Next slide, please. Well, why people are going or are suffering the homeless situation? There are a lot of explications: unemployment, violence, economic and family problems, trauma, sexual assault, and obviously mental disorders play an important role. The prevalence of mental disorders among homeless people has been described in different studies. In Germany, around 75% are suffering axis and all axis 1 disorders. More than 60% are suffering substance disorders. More than 50% are related with the alcoholism. So this kind of illness or this kind of situation are increasing the inability for receiving medical treatments and are increasing the mortality due to suicide. Next, please. In Spain, has been a study in Madrid, in other cities, and the prevalence of mental disorders, substance abuse, is between 35 and 50% of the homeless population. It is not well now what is happening. First, the homeless situation or the mental or substance use disorders. Next, please. Well, so it's clear that homeless people are suffering a high risk in COVID pandemic, as well drug-dependent patients are a risk population. So next, please. In our area, next, please. Next. Yes. In our area, not in Salamanca in general, in Castella, has been recognized as a vulnerable groups in the pandemic situation. So we was asked for doing different programs in order to treat drug-dependent patients, dual diagnosis patients in this pandemic. Next, please. Next. There are some questions as what we can do with the homeless people, how we were responding to the pandemic from the mental health network point of view. Next, please. And we were asked for organize, as I said before, different programs. Our area, now focusing in Salamanca, we have more or less between 300 and 400,000 people, including the inhabitants and including the university students. We have one big university, another smaller university, so we have between 30 or 35,000 extra inhabitants in the academic course between September and June, more or less. So when the pandemic started in March, it is supposed that our population was a little bit less than 400,000 people. Next, please. It is supposed that in our area there are between more or less 70, 80, 90 homeless people. We were contacted by the city hall, we were contacted by the health authorities in order to organize a program focusing in the homeless people with different targets. Of course, treating the mental health condition, and as well, and probably was the main target, trying to avoid that they were using the emergency room, because in the pandemic everybody was asked for be in their homes without go out to the street, and obviously these people were in a high risk of being infected and infected as well to other people, because they have no, it's clear they have no a house. So we did this program for a couple of months, from March to until late May. The next, please. Next, please. And of the 70 people, probably 70, 80 people, some of them moved to a small village or out of the city, and we recruit or were included in the shelter organized by the city health, 29 homeless people. 2 of them were not possible to evaluate it. We evaluate 27 persons, and we detected, as you can see, close to 35% of them have suffering a dual diagnosis condition. As well, there were some of them that they were substance use disorders only. There were another group with only mental disorders different of the substance use disorders. But as you can see, 1 on 3 of the homeless people were suffering a homeless situation. The majority of them have been as a homeless for more than 1 year, more than 40% of them. So they have a lot of medical problems, and they were in bad conditions. The majority of them were males, as expected. There were a group with primary studies, high school, or even there were some university studies. Our city is special in this way, because there are a lot of people that are studying in the university, and some of them are suffering problems later. Close to 40% have medical history, and 25% more or less they have a psychiatric history, a family psychiatric history. Next, please. Well, we did a team with 6 professionals, with 3 sub-teams with 2 people in every sub-teams, that they were evaluated to these patients on site in the shelter that was organized by the city hall. We did 7 times. We visit 7 times this house, and as well we were in contact by phone and by email with the social workers that they had been living with these patients. Of course, there were people that have no mental disorders, as you can see in the previous slide. But the median of the visit that the patient received was between 2 and 3 visits. Obviously, not everybody arrived the same day. They were arriving in the first 10, 50 days that the program or that the house was opened. Next slide, please. Well, there were no gender differences, but obviously the sample is not so, is a small sample, is not so big, so this is normal that we cannot find any gender differences. But I would like to show you that patients receive a psychiatric approach. They receive medication. They have been taking medication that has been prescribed by the GP sometimes, or even by any psychiatrist some months or years ago. But after the intervention, we increased the number of prescriptions. The prescriptions were done in order to avoid the withdrawal symptoms, in order to avoid or to control impulsivity, the psychotic symptoms, etc. We increase, as you can see, the antipsychotic drugs. We try to control the benzodiazepines use. We don't use mood disorders because of the situation. Next slide, please. Well, what we can say when this program finishes. Summary a little bit, because we are late. All the patients were receiving not only a psychiatric approach, as well a social approach. They were connected with the mental health and the drug dependence network of our area, mental health outpatient, drug dependence clinics, therapeutical communities. Next, please. Next slide. And we try to offer some social support, including a small kind of money and a little bit a place when they can live after the confinement. Next, please. Next slide. Well, as you can see, 6 weeks after, so in July, the majority of them were stabilized. Obviously, they have been, some of them have been relapsed a little bit. Some of them has been withdrawal of the clinics, but we are talking about on a very special population that they have a very hard conditions. So this is successful from our point of view, that the majority of them were included in the health system. Next, please. Well, as a conclusion, the paper that I show you is an open access system, so you can see all the results and all the comments that we did quietly. The take-home messages is that something should be done with the homeless people. There are a high prevalence of dual diagnosis among the homeless people that in the pandemic situation should be treated. We have to do things, and if you can organize a good program, the results are good. I didn't say, but neither the patients, neither the professionals were infected, at least in the first part of the program. Obviously, all our professionals were protected completely, because we didn't the serological state at the beginning of this patient. So we unfortunately are in the second wave, and probably this kind of program should be implemented more in other cities, or even probably in our city. In the COVID pandemic, and even when this pandemic will finish it, or will be controlled. So many thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Roncero. Certainly, I think it is a very pioneering experience and with population that is actually not generally out of the scope of common mental health services. Now we move on to our next speaker, and it is, I was actually counting, it's actually surprising, and possibly it's not the best thing, but I mean, it's the only female participant in this session today, and but nevertheless, Dr. Marta Torrens is one of the leading figures in dual disorders, not only in Spain, not only in Europe, but across the world. She is head of one of the pioneering dual disorders unit in Barcelona at Hospital del Mar, one of the key researchers in EMIM, and also professor of psychiatry at the University Autonomous University of Barcelona. And among other things, she's also a consultant for EMCDDA, has been awarded by NIDA, and he's one of the major publication providers in this field. Professor Torrens, Marta.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Let me see. Yes.
Perfect.
Yeah, can you see my presentation?
Yes.
Yes. Yes. Well, first of all, thank you very much, Pepe, for your nice presentation, and thank you very much for the organizers of this meeting for inviting me to talk. Then I would like to talk just, I will try to do my presentation as short as possible, because I know the time and I know that we are sometimes tiring just in front of the PC. Then I would like to talk about last things, maybe not very news, but some things, interesting things in dual depression. Then these are my faculty disclosures. Introduction. Dual depression. What is dual depression? Dual depression is the association of major depression and substance use disorders. And of course, dual depression is the most frequent dual pathology. And the prevalence, it depends on, but it's around 20–60% of the patients seeking treatment. And it depends because it depends on the kind of substance use, or it depends also of this facilities where the patients can go, because you know that in many countries, in fact, the exception is are the countries where there is not. There are two networks for attending the patients, one for mental health and the other for substance use disorder. And our patients, our dual diagnosed patients, has many times the wrong door syndrome. When they are in the dual, in the substance use, they say no, depression is another, and in the opposite, when they have in the mental health, they say no, first you have to stop to take drug to be treated. Well, we know perfectly that patients with major depression have twice as likely to develop substance use disorders, and in the opposite, patients with substance use disorders have twice the risk of suffering from a major depression throughout your life. This is a systematic review of the epidemiological studies about the relations between substance use disorder and mood disorders. And the main result is that for alcohol, the risk of have also a major depression is about 4. The odds ratio is about 4 when there is a dependence. And for other drugs, the ratio is about 5. Then there is a high prevalence, a high association, or the possibility to have a major depression and also a substance use disorder is very high. We are not talking about few people. We are talking about a lot of people. Why? Well, in overall, we have 3 possibilities, 3 hypotheses. The first is that the substance use disorder and the major depression share common risk factors, such as stressful life events, psychological trauma, genetic vulnerability, and or previous neurobiological impairments leading to the co-occurrence of both disorders without a causal relationship. Maybe both disorders are related to same factors, from genetic vulnerability to stressfuls in the young age or even in the late age. This is, at present, maybe this is the more sustained hypothesis. Also, of course, there could be, there is other possibilities. They are not, the other possibilities is that the use of certain substance of abuse leads to now neurobiological change through neuroadaptive mechanisms that mediate major depression. This is very typical in the case of stimulants. For instance, both amphetamines, methamphetamines, cocaine. This is very frequent relationship. And also the other is the self-medication hypothesis that has been previously well explained by Dr. Casas, and that say that major depression increases the risk of behaviors linked to drug use, and of course, later substance use disorders. Anyway, the most important thing at this moment is to detect that they are, that when we have a patient with a substance use disorder, to try to diagnose if there is a depression also, and in the vice versa. If there is, in all the patients that came from depression, we have to evaluate to look for a possible substance use disorder. We can distinguish now the two kinds of depressions: major depression, primary depression, and induced depression. The induced depression is those depression that even that they has all the symptoms of depression, it appears only during change in the drug use, even because the patient is increasing the drug use, or even because the patient is decreasing the drug use. When there are changes in the drug use, we can, and then there are the symptoms of depression, we can think in induced depression. And also primary depression is more related to patients that are using the same drug, the same quantity of drug in a stable consumption, or after abstinence, or they have a family depression, family history of depression. This is important because we know, and we have last results that maybe the treatment for these patients will be different. What is important, the dual depression? The dual depression is important because has clinical characteristics and relevance for the prognosis of our patients. We know that both depression are associated with unfavorable progress of substance use disorder. And also, the presence of the substance use disorder is associated with unfavorable major depression progress. Then also we know that these patients have higher prevalence of attempted and completed suicides. And also they have more medical and psychiatric comorbidities, also more, including more substance use disorders. Then we are talking about some patients that they have more social problems and they use more health resources, and they, including more psychiatric admissions, they are really expensive patients for our health system if we don't diagnose and treat them adequately. Then an important thing, dual depression from the sex perspective. We know that dual depression is by two times more prevalent in women than in men with any sort. In the case of this, we know that this is the same that happens in general population. But even dual depression in women that are also with substance use disorders, the prevalence of depression is twice more than women without substance use disorder. Then, first take-home message. In one woman that came to treatment, for seeking treatment for substance use disorder, please look and look for the possibility of also a depression. Also, we know that these are related many times to other complications. One of the things that we know, and we have many studies and even at the European, in different countries of Europe, that the women with dual depression, they have more possibilities to be experiencing intimate partner violence. And also, they have more possibilities to have more behaviors of risk for HIV and hepatitis C infection. Also, another point that is very interesting is that perinatal depression is more prevalent in women with substance use disorder than in women without substance use disorder. Then this is important because in many countries, like in Spain, to have as a use of drugs after in perinatal, it implies that many times they take out your children. And this is the most important thing, this is very relevant that these women, they have also more possibilities to have a depression and also more possibilities to relapse in drug use. Then we know that we have a problem in this. Then for treatment, general recommendations. The treatment of dual depression should take both disorders into account. A depressive episode should be treated even though the patient is actively using substances. The addiction should be treated even if the patient is in a depressive episode. The effects of the antidepressants are greater when patients have primary major depression. But also, always we have to consider pharmacological and psychotherapeutic approach. Wrong door is not possible. Always we have to treat these patients with both together at the same time. And how? About pharmacology, we have a problem because the first is efficacy of the treatment. And we know that SSRI, that are the more frequent antidepressant used, they have demonstrated clearly not efficacy. They are different meta-analysis of, and they, even the last Cochrane review, and the SSRI are not efficacy, have not efficacy in the treatment of dual depression. They are very few studies, randomized clinical trials, but the few studies have demonstrated that the only that have efficacy are the tricyclics. And the other thing is that any treatment with antidepressants improve the substance use disorder. This is also very important. We have to treat both together, but with different view. Then the other point, safety. Tricyclic antidepressants, they have a lot of side effects and also they have the risk of death with overdoses. And also, and this is very important, tricyclic antidepressants, trazodone, mirtazapine, and citalopram, they increase the risk of QTc interval prolongation. And this is very important in patients that are under methadone treatment, for instance. Another thing that we have to take into account is the abuse liability of the drugs that we will give to the patient for treatment. And in this sense, aminitin, antianeptin have demonstrated that they have some abuse liability. In relation to the interactions, this is one review that it has been published. about the interactions, and in relation to opioids, the most important is the increase of QTC, but also there are differences with others about that. Then, just trying to arrive to conclusions. What is the therapeutic algorithm for the treatment of dual depression? First, we have to treat all the moderate, severe depressions, dual depressions. It's not important if they are primary or induced. If they are moderate, severe, they have to be treated. And the treatment must be pharmacological and psychosocial, and must be just for the specific for the substance use disorder and also for the major depression. In relation to the substance use disorder, we know that there are different treatments for the substance use: naltrexone, nalmefene, acamprosate, disulfiram for alcohol, and for opiates, methadone, buprenorphine, morphine sustained release, naltrexone. For nicotine, also we have very good treatments. In the case of the symptomatology of depressive symptomatology, the only thing that we know is that SSRI are not good for all patients with dual diagnosis. They have demonstrated at least 10 in 10 or 12 randomized clinical trials that they have not efficacy for the treatment of dual depression, for the depression in these patients. Then there are others that maybe we can try, but only tricyclic antidepressants has demonstrated the efficacy, but they have secondary side effects that can be relevant. The others, duloxetine, bupropion, agomelatine, they are not very good clinical trials. They are not research in this sense. It's just empirically that we can provide them. There are only one special thing that I would like to talk just in the last minutes. In relation to the opioid use disorder with major depression. In this case, we know that we have methadone, buprenorphine, morphine sustained release, and naltrexone. And just look that. We know now that all the treatment that we provide for the agonist treatment are related to the agonist in receptors mu. And in this sense, we have the morphine, that is the standard, but also the diacetylmorphine, of course, methadone. Buprenorphine is a partial agonist, but the evidence about the use of buprenorphine as opioid substitution, like opioid substitution treatment, is very good. Okay, and but we have also other receptors, and they are the kappa receptors that in the last years has more relevance. And we have some drugs that are agonists and some drugs that are antagonists of the kappa receptor. In this sense, I would like to know, just to review, that after the study of the kappa opioid receptors, there is many evidence that the kappa opioid agonist can be used as antimanic. And the agonist, the kappa partial agonist, can be used as mood stabilizer. And the kappa opioid antagonist, maybe they can be used as antidepressants. And we have one that is buprenorphine, that is good as a partial agonist for mu, but also a big antagonist of kappa antagonist. Then there are different studies. This is a systematic review about all the studies about the use of buprenorphine for major depression and treatment of resistant depression and non-suicidal self-injury behavior and suicidal behavior. Just in short, this review has demonstrated that buprenorphine at low doses is efficacious, well tolerated, and a safe option in reducing depressive symptoms, serious suicidal ideation, and also for non-suicidal self-injury. Then the problem, it has been studied much more in the sense of provide buprenorphine, but the problem of the partial agonism has done that there is another molecule that is samidorphan that try to block the agonist effect, the partial agonist effect of the buprenorphine in mu, to avoid the addiction related to the activation, even partial, of the mu receptor. But what happened with the patients that they have an opioid use disorder? This is not a problem. We have to treat even these patients. And if the patient has an opioid use disorder and also a depression, maybe buprenorphine is the election. And maybe with buprenorphine, we have a dual treatment, a dual drug for a dual disorder. Just to finish, in relation to the COVID, this is one problem, you know, very important problem. And we know that the dual depression has increased the prevalence in relation to the COVID pandemic. And also there is an increase of depression related to isolation, the increase of severity of stressful life events, and also there is increase of some cases of drug use and others a decrease. It depends. For instance, is clearly an increase of legal drugs and cannabis also in Spain, because it's very, very usual to, and it's not difficult to obtain. And one thing that I would like to talk, just to finish, is, and that we have seen in our harm reduction facilities. You know that in Barcelona we have 8 harm spaces to self-injection facilities. And one of the things is that they say that maybe sometimes it's not the increase of deaths of, they are not suicide. This is just because the patients, they say, why to live? And this is one of the accidental overdoses that we have detected, the previously called accidental overdoses, but now with the social inequalities, we expect an increase of the deaths of despair in our patients. Then, conclusions, dual depression is common, we have to treat, and is a continuity to treat and to discover best treatment for our patients affected for dual depression. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Marta. It's always very thorough and very useful, very up-to-date information. Now we have our last speaker for the night. It's been a long session, but we have a great finish with Professor Maremmani. He's a professor of addiction medicine at the University of Pisa and University of Siena, as well as member of the board of directors of the Department of Psychiatry at the Hospital de la Chiara in Pisa. He's been founder of Europad. He has one of the leading personalities in addiction medicine and in dual disorders, and over 600 publications. I mean, a vast research, a vast academic, a vast clinical experience that he's going to share with us tonight. Thank you, Ikram.
Thank you, Joseph, for your presentation. And this is my disclosure. Do we need only craving and relapse to make a diagnosis of drug addiction? Is it possible that drug addiction is without a specific psychopathology, and when psychopathology is present, this is due to the presence of a comorbidity? 10 years ago, our group discussed the problem of the existence of a specific psychopathology of drug addicts, supporting the evidence that anxiety, mood, and impulse discontrol must be included in the diagnosis of drug addiction. And 10 years after, I will present our data regarding the validity of our hypothesis, the hypothesis that a specific psychopathology of heroin addicts do exist. We started our research history using a sample self-report symptom inventory, the SCL-19, to try to have a subtype of psychopathology in people entering treatment. When we analyzed the factorial analysis of SCL-19 in psychiatric patients, we have a 9-factor solution with somatization, obsessive-compulsive, symptomatology, interpersonal sensitivity, depression, anxiety, hostility, phobic anxiety, paranoid ideation, and psychotic ideation. But when we make this factorialization in addicted patients, we have only 5 factors: worthlessness and being trapped, somatic symptoms, sensitivity, psychoticism, panic, anxiety, and violence, suicide. So, on the basis of the highest zeta score obtained for each factor, we can cluster all the subjects into 5 groups. We can call this group dominant groups. At treatment entry, the majority of the patients were characterized by somatic symptoms, but this is consistent with the fact that were they requesting a treatment with agonist opioid. The second more frequent dimension is the anxiety dimension, then the aggressive dimension, then the psychotic dimension, and finally our specific depressive dimension characterized by feelings of worthlessness and being trapped. Please note that all drug addicts presenting for treatment is possible to put all patients in one of these subgroups. And these subgroups are related to the age of our patients, especially people, the score of worthlessness and being trapped is higher in older people, and in younger people, more severity of sensitivity, psychoticism, and the violence and suicide. But our psychopathology is really stable because is independent of the choice of treatment, is independent of active substance use, is independent of a lifetime psychiatric problem, is independent of the choice of substance used, heroin, alcohol, or cocaine, and also is independent in mono-user patients. Is independent of stress sensitivity, is independent of 3 months non-use in therapeutic community, and it is also independent of ethnicity. We studied migrants and we compared Slovenian and Italian drug addicts. And there is no differences. There is differences in severity, but not differences in typology. With our psychopathology is strictly correlated to heroin addictive behavior, strictly correlated to stress sensitivity, but is also strictly correlated to alcohol addictive behavior. It's important to have behavioral covariate of craving, because craving is only a subjective experience, and we have no the system to have an objective evaluation of craving, and we think that the behavioral covariate of craving are important, and the psychopathology is strictly correlated with these covariates. But this psychopathology can differentiate other psychopathology. We can well discriminate psychopathology between major depression, chronic psychosis, and heroin use disorder patients. We can partially discriminate heroin use disorder from obese non-psychiatric patients. And we can perfectly discriminate young people with problematic and non-problematic internet use. But we cannot discriminate gamblers from heroin use disorder. This is really interesting, because you know that gamblers and heroin use disorder patients are in the same diagnostic cluster in DSM-5. And is, in my vision, particularly important that our psychopathology can distinguish very well reward relief craving in cocaine users versus adult ADHD cocaine users. And this is our latest study, can distinguish also problematic versus non-problematic recreational drinkers. So is useful in patients, but is useful also in people that is not addict. So far, so good. We can say that worthlessness and being trapped is something linked to mood dysregulation. We can say that panic anxiety is linked to anxiety dysregulation, and the violent suicide is correlated with impulse control dysregulation. Somatic symptoms are very similar to withdrawal symptomatology, and the sensitivity of psychoticism is not clear what can represent. But I want to start to discuss also the problem of stress sensitivity, because we know that stress sensitivity is a pre-existing condition of drug addiction, but we have a different idea at this regard. In our hospital, there is a group, a research group, studying the PTSD spectrum. What is the PTSD spectrum? The PTSD spectrum is the emotional reaction to life events with a symptomatology very similar to PTSD symptomatology, but without the exposure to a dramatic events as in post-traumatic stress disorder. It means that in respect to life events, we can have a grief reaction, we can have a reaction to losses or upsetting event, re-experiencing, avoidance and numbing, maladaptive coping, arousal, and risk, personal characteristics or risk factors. And we have used the rating scale for to assess the spectrum in psychiatric people and also in heroin use disorder patients. In this first study, the question was the possible existence of a variation in the number of stressful life events between before and after heroin use disorder age of onset. And you can see that passing from before to after the continued use of heroin, there is an increment of traumatic and loss events, also if the time of the observational time is shorter. And in this slide, you can see the differences between before and after. And so we started to think about an unitary perspective between post-traumatic stress disorder and substance use disorder. The question were, are correlation between PTSD spectrum and severity of heroin addiction significant? Are opioid medication able to reduce reaction to life events in heroin addicts during treatment? And we can answer yes to all the two answers. Yes, more severe is heroin addiction, and more severe are the presence, more frequent is the presence, and more severe is the symptomatology of the PTSD spectrum. And people treated with methadone, if we have a high level of methadone, we can find a low level of PTSD spectrum severity. So we have another question, intriguing, really intriguing question. Can heroin addiction generate a sort of PTSD? We can answer this question considering people survived to the earthquake of L'Aquila earthquake, and people developing PTSD and people not developing PTSD. We have a PTSD post-traumatic PTSD spectrum also in this kind of people, and 32 is the cutoff dividing subject developing PTSD after L'Aquila earthquake and the people who did not develop this. And so we try to test the differences between people with long-lasting heroin use disorder and young people, survivor to earthquake with PTSD spectrum and not PTSD spectrum. Consider that long-lasting heroin use disorder patients were never exposed to a traumatic event like earthquake or a dramatic event, but the frequency of post-traumatic stress disorder is very similar in PTSD earthquake survivor and long-lasting heroin use disorder patients. And in this slide, you can see that the difference is very minimal in this two subgroup and less severe in people not developing post-traumatic stress disorder after the earthquake. And what is the sense of studying this psychopathology? Is it only an heuristic issue, or is useful for the diagnosis of heroin addiction, and especially for the treatment of heroin addiction? In other words, methadone and buprenorphine have the same impact on psychopathological symptoms of heroin addicts. If we consider the factorialization of SEL19 with 9 factors, there is no difference from methadone and buprenorphine. Of course, patients treated with the methadone and buprenorphine improve if treated with methadone and buprenorphine, but this improvement is not specific for the factors of SEL19. But if we consider the new formulation, the new factorialization, you can see that buprenorphine is better in people with the dominant violence suicide dimension, and the methadone is better in people with a dominant sensitivity psychoticism dimension at treatment entry. But this is not only important for the pharmacological treatment, but is also interesting also when we are treating people in a residential treatment. As you can see, also in people treated in a therapeutic community, patients with the dominant symptomatology, violence, suicide symptomatology, are not with good results. So, if we have patients entering or requesting treatment with the dominant violence, suicide symptomatology, we have a good prediction of good results treating them with buprenorphine and not put them in therapeutic community. So the psychopathology, we think specific to heroin use disorder, but also substance use disorder, is interesting at diagnostic level, but also at treatment level. If you want to study this issue in details, you can, of course, read this book, and reading this book, you can support the activity of our research group. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Igor, for your excellent presentation. Now we have accumulated a bit of delay altogether through the night, so I think it's been a long night in most places. We'd like to, therefore, to finish, but I would like to ask the organizer, Professor Mehdi Paez, who's kindly invited us to participate in this symposium, to make a final remarks, a final comments for this session, so that as I said, Professor Paez. Well, there seems to be some connection difficulties.
See, Well, I think that of course you can close the session. It's up to you to do that. Huh? You can.
Sure. No, but as I said, if you want to make a final remarks or final comments for the session.
No.
No. Okay. Well, as I said, thank you very much. Yeah. Well, thank you, Mehdi. Thank you, Professor Paez, for inviting us and for organizing this fantastic conference. And thank you all the participants for your excellent presentations. Hope to see you soon and hope to see you in person, because I mean, this is really become quite awkward at the end of the day. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you all. Thank you. And